Good morning, everyone. How's it going? Good? Good. I'm looking at the time so I don't go over like Sammy. I'm sorry, Sam. I had to do it. So, as Sammy said, my name is Karla. I have been a part of the Soma City team for a year now, which is wild. And during the last few months, we were just kind of discussing whether I should preach or not. And we just went back and forth a lot, and I was a little unsure. But I decided, well, why not? I think sometimes I'm really good at running away from what sometimes I think Jesus is calling me to do. And so then I thought I just have to do it. So now I'm here. So this morning, I wanted to share a story that I've read a million times over. If you are new to the Bible or had never even read the Bible, there's this guy, his name is Abraham. And Abraham is known for being the father of the Christian faith. And so the story of Abraham is a little complicated. It's very messy. He has a wife, and her name is Sarah. And so they live in this city, and God comes to Abraham and says, "Hey, Abraham, I want you to leave your family behind. I want you to leave everything you've ever known. And I'm going to send you to a land where I will bless you." And so along the way, so Abraham says yes to the Lord. And along the way, they end up in Egypt due to a famine. And in Egypt, things get a little bit messy. I think he might have missed a couple marriage counseling sessions because he told the Pharaoh that his wife was his sister. And I just, like, what are you thinking, sir? But here we are. And so because of that, Egypt receives, a judgment. And the Pharaoh realizes that it's because Abraham had lied to him. And so in the midst of that, Pharaoh calls him out, sends him on his way. And this is where we find the story that I actually want to tell you. So because they were in Egypt and they were sent out, Sarah ended up with an Egyptian servant. And her name is Hagar. So a little bit about my background. I grew up in a Christian home, and so both of my parents are pastors. And so I think at one point in my life, I don't remember reading any other children's books besides my children's Bible. And so the story of Sarah and Abraham was just always so consistent, and it just came up over and over again. And then in recent years, I read the full story in Genesis. And I saw a name that I just didn't recognize before. And her name was Hagar. And Hagar is this woman who is just so quiet and unseen. She appears twice in the Bible. And she's just like an enigma. And so another part of the story with Abraham and Sarah is that along the way, God also tells Abraham, "I'm going to give you a son." But the problem was that Sarah couldn't have any kids. And so in I think, an act of desperation, I can't imagine how Sarah felt in that moment, thinking my husband has to have descendants and I can't do that. And so I think in an act of desperation, she sends Hagar to be with Abraham. And in that moment, Hagar gets pregnant. And so the story tells us that when Hagar realizes that she was pregnant, she starts mistreating Sarah because she realizes that she has something that Sarah doesn't have. And so Sarah gets angry, and then she tells Abraham, "What am I supposed to do?" And he says, "Well, she's your servant, so you do as you will." And so the Message version of the Bible tells us that Sarah is abusive to Hagar. And so Hagar's response is to run away. But they are in the middle of the wilderness. And there are no cities. There's no New York City. There's no Chicago. It's just desert. And so in the midst of that, I think I always read that story and thought, well, why would she do that? Like, she should have been nice to Sarah. She should have been kind to her. Sarah also had a lot going on. And I think I just took Sarah's side. And then I thought, wait, who is this woman again? Who is Hagar? And I thought, I've never seen her point of view before. She was a slave. She was a woman. And so in Hebrew, her name means the stranger, the outsider. And I just thought, I think there's something here. And so I read her story, and this is what I want to share with you. So I pulled up Genesis 16. I think we have it on our notes. But it will be Genesis 16, 7 through 13, or 14, sorry. So I will read that, and you can follow along in your Bible or on your phones. So I will, here we go. The angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness. So at this point, Hagar had just run away because she didn't know what else to do in her situation. And the angel said to her, Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from, and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarah, she replied. Well, at this point, Sarah's name was Sarai, but that's a different story. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. Then he added, I will give you more descendants than you can count. And the angel also said, you are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You are to name him Ishmael, which means the God who hears. For the Lord has heard your cry of distress. This son of yours will be a wild man and untamed as a wild donkey. He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility against all his relatives. Thereafter, Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord, who had spoken to her, and she said, you are the God who sees me. And she also said, have I truly seen the only one who sees me? So that well was named Beer Lahai Roi, which means well of the living one who sees me. So I just want you to take a breath with me. Here we go. And repeat, you are the God who sees me. Do it again. You are the God who sees me. How does that make you feel? I think at one point of my life, that made me feel very scared. I'm thinking of the God of the universe, the God who created the earth and just words. He just spoke, and the earth came, and he spoke us into being, and his breath is in us. And that this huge God sees me. And I thought, if he really sees me, I don't want him to see me. Because I just kept thinking, do you know who I am? Do you know how many times I have failed? Do you know that for so long I didn't want to forgive anybody who hurt me? Did you know that I am a liar? Did you know that I hide? And I kept thinking of all the things that were wrong with me. And it just blew my mind that this God could see me. And my first reaction was to hide because I didn't want him to see the real me. The real me is messy. The real me wakes up with hair and it's everywhere. And the real me, I'm serious. The real me is just scared, And the more I thought about it, there was this moment in my life when, and I was a little hesitant to share this story, But this morning when I was praying, I just kept feeling, oh, I think I'm going to do it. So here we are. And a few years ago in my life, I read this story and I realized that Hagar was in the wilderness. Hagar was alone. She was pregnant, and that's scary. And she didn't have a title in the community that she was in. She was the lowest of the low. And one day, this woman comes up to me, and I wish I remember her name. I remember she had bright pink hair. And she said, Karla, can I pray for you? And, I'm all for prayers. So she said, I just really feel like God sees you. And I thought, oh, yeah. And then she says, I think he sees you like John. And if you don't know the Bible very much, or even if you do, so the Johns that I think of at the top of my head are John the Baptist and John the Apostle. And so John the Baptist is known for living in the wilderness and eating honey and locusts, which is weird. And he prepared the way of the Lord. He was Jesus' cousin, and so he even got to baptize Jesus, which is really cool. And so when she said, God sees you as John, my brain automatically went, the Baptist. I want to prepare the way of the Lord. I want to, I want people to meet Jesus. And then she said, John the Beloved. And John the Beloved is John the Apostle. And I love the story. That's a side story because John describes himself as the apostle that Jesus loved. But he's the one who writes that. So I just think it's really interesting. But either way, I remember her saying that. And I was in a church kind of. And so it was a prayer room. And I sat in that prayer room for 2 hours just crying because I realized that for so long, I didn't think that I was the beloved. I didn't see myself as the beloved. And it was so interesting because, like I said, I grew up in a Christian home and I grew up what I thought following the Lord. But I think in my mind, maybe I had an idea of a God who was expecting perfection. And that's not what he's looking for. I think in my head, he had set a table for everybody else, but not for me. And so I remember sitting there and thinking, God, who do you see today? And I just started writing down the things that I thought were not worthy of me. And I thought of my whole life, I had struggled with low self-esteem. I didn't think I was pretty enough. I didn't think, all the things, all the lies. And in that moment, he said, do you see the way that I see you? Do you see that I made your hair, and so I think it's beautiful? Do you see that you're a part of a culture? So I was born in Peru, and it's a very lively culture. And I think for so long, I was in America, so I was trying to assimilate. And, and he said, do you know that you're part of this culture for a reason? Do you know that it's okay to celebrate that culture, and it's okay to still want to speak Spanish and to still want to salsa dance? And there were so many parts. There were so many parts of my life that I just didn't think were worthy. And I remember I could not believe what was happening. Suddenly, I even remember the outfit that I was wearing that day because I just thought, oh my gosh, God can see my outfit. Like, God can see everything. But in the midst of that, I think that's when it hit me that he just wasn't waiting for me to be a holier version of me. And he wasn't waiting for me to be a purer, is that a word? Version of me. He wasn't waiting. I think in my head, I just wanted to be Jesus. I wanted to be perfection. But that's not how it works. How it works is that we have a story, and because we're here, our stories are messy, and because we're here, life is just hard sometimes. Even, what Sammy is talking about today, I think of all the events that are happening in our current world and how that affects our own hearts, and how we love each other and how we love others. And I wanted to be perfect in that. I wanted to be perfect in having no prejudice in my heart. I wanted to be perfect in the way that I loved every person. And that's just not how it works, because how it works is this process called sanctification, where we get to be in friendship with Jesus, and in that moment is how we turn a little bit more like him, and we become a little bit more like him when we are in friendship with him. But I just wanted it to be perfect. And so in that moment, I think I thought of all the other times when Jesus showed up and didn't expect anything else but just to be with a person. And so as I was writing this list, I was actually just crying my eyes out because I just couldn't believe that this is the God that we get to call friend, and this is the God who sees us. But when I look at the New Testament, I see a Jesus who stopped to talk to a woman at a well, who not even the people in her own community would even come close to. The story says that she used to go to the well at noon, which is when it's the hottest time of the day. And she would go there because she knew that she wasn't welcome in the morning when everybody else was there. And Jesus comes and talks to her and asks for a drink from her, and didn't ask, why are you not this way? Or why are you this way? He just came for conversation. And then I think of Jesus, who touched the leper and healed him. And if you don't know, also in that culture, lepers were outside of the city. They weren't even welcome. And again, I see him touching him, not really caring what could happen to him. And also in that culture, if you touched somebody who was a leper, you were considered unclean. But Jesus didn't care. Jesus just showed up and he touched them. And then I think of Jesus who called Peter and John. And Peter and John are some of my favorite dudes in the Bible because they were fishermen. And they had no status in their community. They weren't religious leaders. They didn't, Jesus was a rabbi, and they weren't. And Jesus stops and calls them by name. And then he turned them into storytellers. And these storytellers are the reason why we get to be here today. He called the outsider so that we wouldn't be outsiders. And I just love that, And then I think of Jesus who washed the feet of his friends. He took the lowest form of a servant. And again, not caring what anybody else had to say. And he just went and he saw them. And I think the story that, or maybe one of the biggest moments for me in what Jesus does is that Jesus is having dinner with his friends, and he knows that one of them is going to betray him. And Jesus doesn't close his table. Jesus says, "You're welcome." And he eats bread with him, and he shares bread with him. And even though he knew he was going to betray him, he sees him. And I think, how beautiful is this God who is, I love that line of that song, "You're bigger than I thought you were." But I also think, I think you're much smaller than I think you were. And not in a bad way, but in a humility kind of way. That you would come and you would stand this close to my face. That he's not just an idea, but he's the breath here. And that's a little too close for me. And it's scary, And so, but again, the God who sees you right now, right this second. Another reason why I love the story of Hagar is because after I experience that and learning that God sees me, I was just so curious about what people had to say. And so I started reading a lot about Hagar, and I found out that in the African American community, she is known as a beacon of hope because she was an outsider, she was a slave, and she was a woman. And through the times of slavery, her story carried a power that we would have missed. And I have missed it my whole life until this happened to me. And so here's this woman again who calls God the God who sees. And another interesting thing about this is that she is the one who does the naming in this story. A lot of the times we see God changing the names of people in the Bible. But she is the one who looks at God and says, "You are the God who sees me." And so I think in that moment, she understood something about God that I don't think we even see in the text, that we don't even get to experience. She experienced the God who sees. And I loved that she was an outsider, and because I do think that so many times we see ourselves as the outsider. And last week, when Jonathan Wynn was preaching, and like Sammy said, I think all week I've just told everybody, please go listen to the sermon. It is the best sermon I've heard. And it's just so good. But one of the things that really struck me when he was speaking was that he gave us a list of people that we should love without thinking of what other people might think. And in our culture, I think the communities that are unseen are the people living in generational poverty, the people who are trying to work in racial reconciliation. He talked about people who have different religious beliefs. I think it's so easy to just say, well, we don't agree, so I'm going to put you aside. But again, Jesus never did that. And so I love this list and I'm going to keep going because this was brilliant. And he said, we need to embrace the refugee and the undocumented immigrant. And to me, that was so personal because I don't know how many of you know my story, but I too am an undocumented immigrant. And I thought, this is the God who sees. the God who sees immigrants when the outsider, when there's no one else in the wilderness with you. And he added the LGBTQ community. He sees you today. If you're here, he sees you and he loves you so much. Yes, and so I just like this list that he gave us just really reminded me of all the people that we put aside because, they don't fit into our box. They don't fit into my box. And Jesus is just calling us to see them the way that he sees us. And so, as I close, I don't want to speak for too long. I just wanted to remind you that in the story of Hagar, we see a God who is not afraid to go out to the desert if that's where you are today. He's not afraid to show up. And in her story, we get to see the angel of the Lord. But many times in our lives, it's just a friend who showed up, Sometimes in our lives is the phone call just to check in how you're doing. Sometimes in our lives, one of my favorite reminders that the Lord sees me is when I see little Elias Furia come up to me and give me a high five. It is the most precious thing. He's my favorite. But every time he just has so much joy and he's so curious about everything. And I just think, you have to know the Lord. I know you know the Lord. And there's just something so beautiful about that. And so, oh, hi, Doug. I didn't see you there. That's Elias's dad. And so, yeah, how does God show up for you in your life? I'm an Enneagram type 4, so I think beauty is a reminder of God's presence in my life. So when I see a sunflower bloom, to me, that is God seeing me. But maybe you're an Enneagram 3 like Sammy, and so maybe to you it's different. Maybe to you is when you see yourself working in excellence. And maybe that's how God sees you. And so it's different for everybody. And then I also think of how Hagar is brave enough to give a name to God. Because God is the creator. God is our savior. God is sovereign. But what is God to you today? Today, I need a friend. And God has been my friend. Many times I've needed a mother. God is my mom. Many times I wanted to be with my grandma. And God was my grandma. She could tell me fun stories. So who is God to you today? Who is he showing himself as to you? He is always good. And he's always kind. And so I know that he wants to be in your life in a very real way. And I think of Hagar again, who was carrying a promise. Because if you keep reading her story, you see that God does bless her. God blesses the baby that she was carrying inside of her. And so I think, what is the promise that God has given you? He's not forgotten the promise. It took, I think, 13 or 14 years for Hagar to be sent out, which means that she was free. But God didn't forget her. The promise still is happening today. And so, what is the promise that you're holding on to? What is he reminding you of right now? He hasn't forgotten you. He doesn't think it's not worth it anymore. If anything, it's ever present in his heart. And so I wanted to just read a couple of encouragements. And so to you, single mom, he sees you today. To you who are struggling with depression and anxiety, he sees you today, and he's not afraid. To you who are going through a divorce, he sees you today, and he's right there. To you who are struggling with loneliness, he's right there, and he's hugging you, and he's loving on you, and he wants to be with you. He wants to be your friend. To you, whom something was taken from you without your consent, he sees you, and his heart is broken like yours. And to you who think that you need to have a perfect life to meet Jesus, he sees you, and he's already met you, so you don't have to run or hide anymore. To you who are differently able, God sees you today. To you who are part of the LGBTQ plus community, God sees you and has never hesitated in his love for you. And this one is for my dad. Papi, to you, the engineer who gave up your career in a different country to come clean houses in the United States so that our family could survive. He sees you. He has not forgotten you. And he knows your dreams. And he loves you so very much. He's so proud of you. And so today, if you don't remember anything else I've said, I just want you to know that God sees you. God loves you. This whole week as I prayed, I was just so overwhelmed because I thought of all the names that I know in this community, of all the faces and all the stories. And I just thought, oh man, I just want them to know how loved they are. That they don't need to do anything. They just can be. You can be with Jesus. You don't have to become perfect. You don't have to hide. You can just be. He's waiting for you today. And he wants to be with you today. And his table is open. Even for the times when we have run away, he's already running towards us. And so that's all I wanted to share with you.